Okay, good morning, everybody. We'd like to welcome you out to our final in our comprehensive literacy webinar series. Today we have Dr. Jessica Costa from our English language and learner instruction program here at VDOE, and she has some awesome strategies to share with you really from across the academic spectrum. As you know, literacy is not limited just to our ELA classrooms. And she has some awesome ways for you to both approach and address that in your classroom. So without any further ado, I will let her take the wheel here, and we hope everyone enjoys. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'm excited to share some of the work that I've been doing, some research, and really just practical ways for you to enhance your literacy instruction, specifically thinking about your English learners. So for today, I'm going to just start out with a bit of introduction to the concept of academic language instruction, as well as some connections to the prior English webinars. Then we will dig into a variety of ways that you can support your content or grade level instruction. We will analyze academic language that's found within SOL tasks, and then just look at a couple of additional resources that you can access after the webinar for your continued professional learning or questions. So the specific objectives, twofold in terms of what you will be able to do as a result of the webinar, describe those various supports for English learners that we'll go through, and then to identify the language, specifically language functions and some sentence frames or language frames connected to your grade level SOLs. And we'll get into what I mean by functions and frames in the webinar. So just to start, if you have any questions as I'm going through the presentation, please feel free to add those into the chat feature. You can find that at the bottom of your, or the icon at the bottom of your screen. And then we'll collect those and anything that we are not able to address during the webinar. Before we post the PowerPoint, we will address those within the materials. So I wanted to start out thinking about what is academic language instruction, or who are we really gearing our instruction towards? So if you would take a moment to read these ideas. So while this webinar is focused on English learners, any student who is learning that content for the first time also is learning the language that's being used to teach that content for the first time. So there's not really a native speaker of academic language. And thinking about that instruction and that point, then even if you have one English learner, your instruction would be the same as we think about analyzing the language demands that are within the SOL and bringing those out, making them language objectives, not just for English learners, but for all of these students who really need the background in academic language development. Thinking for a moment, as a proficient English speaker reader, I might go into a mechanic shop, and besides trying to describe what sounds might be happening with my car, I don't really have the language to explain what's happening or what those issues are. So that is a very specific language in that context. So thinking about academic language in that same way. If we're teaching a lesson on plot and describing setting and character development, there are very specific ways we use language within those lessons. So it's about making that explicit to all of the students, teaching them how to sound like poets or historians or scientists, whatever the content of a text is, that they would be able to then really explain their learning in sophisticated ways and growing in sophistication if we think about this idea of language development. Here are another couple of ideas that I'd like you to review. If you reflect on what some of our end assessments are, so take the standard of learning test, for example, it is not a test of matching vocabulary to definition or vocabulary to picture. So if we reflect on our instruction that is preparing students to show what they know in that way, how is our instruction supporting their success? So academic language is beyond this focus on vocabulary. While vocabulary is key to comprehension, that's only one piece of the puzzle. That how we teach students to use that vocabulary in sentences, understand it within complex readings. That is how we make academic instruction or explicit academic instruction work for English learners, is being explicit about the context, the purpose for language use, and all of the language that students would really need to be successful to access that text or to explain their learning, to write a composition, whatever the standard requires. And then within meaningful contexts, there's a lot on grammar instruction. And so we don't want grammar instruction for the sake of grammar instruction. We're not working with English learners. Best practice would not be to provide a worksheet just on using commas or periods or the past tense, but that we situate it within a meaningful context. Why are we learning this? What is the purpose for communication here? So that grammar, mechanics, usage all fall within, we want to be effective communicators, and we learn it within a context, and that students are more likely to retain that because it's purposeful, it's meaningful, it's authentic. Here is just a screenshot. I don't expect you to be able to read all of the information, but when this is posted, the hyperlink, or the graphic itself, is hyperlinked, as well as the source listed at the bottom. This is something that I've been able to create based on research from different areas of making sure that our EL instruction is part of core instruction. It is tier 1. This is not something that is provided as an intervention. This is something that all students would need. It's actually a civil right for the students to be able to have access to the unique instruction focused on academic language that they will need to be successful. And reflecting, if you think about your schedule and your day with English learners, and that in comparison to what it might be for a language instruction educational program, or LIEP specialist, so the ESL teacher, in other words, most of the day an EL spends in instruction is with a grade level teacher or content teachers. They may have 45 minutes every other day, if that, with an EL specialist. So it's really upon all of us together as instructors of content to understand how to make that instruction accessible, and also develop student language so that they can eventually exit from EL service. How we do this, best practice shows us that collaborative efforts, if it's in a co-teaching situation, but also if it's not, how are the EL specialist and content teacher collaborating, sharing plans, sharing strategies, so that regardless of where the student is, even if they are in a session where it is just English learners with an EL specialist, that teacher is still reinforcing content that is happening in the other courses. So it's really content-based language instruction in that setting, and then using content to support the language development. And the other way around for content classes. You are focused on teaching content, but making that language explicit so students can access that content. There are ELD standards, as you can see on the right-hand side of the screen. They look a little different from the typical content SOLs in that they are not grade level specific. There is one specific, if you look at the English Language Development Standard 2, how English learners will communicate information, ideas, concepts necessary for academic success in the content area of language arts, specifically for this webinar. There's also one thinking about making the language explicit and having students communicate for social and instructional purposes. For example, collaboration. That's an instructional purpose for communication that's going to happen across the grade levels, across the content areas. So making sure that we set students up for success by giving them opportunities to practice the language models we provide, and right within those as a means of communication, making sure that we build in the 4 domains, which you see the graphic on the left. In order for students to reach English language proficiency, they need support in all 4 of these language domains, and we will work to integrate those within lessons, which is something that you would have heard from prior English specific webinars, that we are integrating the SOL skills and domains of reading, writing, research, communication, and multimodal literacies, but also that we're integrating these 4 language domains. So within each lesson or unit, students have opportunities to use all 4 of these domains. Why that's important specifically for English learners, just a bit of background, they are assessed within each of these domains every year. And we can identify domains of strength for students. For example, speaking. Students might be using higher academic language when they are speaking. And then that, if they are given ample opportunity to practice that within the lesson, if the teacher is making explicit connections to writing and how that speaking should support their writing, we also see the writing growth. So by incorporating all of the domains, teachers can leverage the students' domains of strength to continue to develop the domains that need some more support and practice. And then all the way on the left, just another idea from research is why this is important specifically in language arts, and going back to that idea of communication and opportunities to practice the content within connected and purposeful ways. So we are now going to get into the various supports. In order to make our English language arts lessons more accessible and inclusive, there are a variety of ways we can support both language development and content access. So we're going to dig into each of those, and then we will follow that up with identifying the specific language needed. As we talk about linguistic supports or the language supports, we'll need to identify the language of language objectives to be able to give students support in that practice. One of those supports starting out is peer interaction. Part of getting students involved and engaged in lessons is giving them an opportunity to discuss the content with their peers. There's also research and literature on how these help students to develop cognitive skills. I think I've heard before, growing the brain, in terms of when they have the opportunity to hear multiple ideas, different ideas, and the opportunity to share them. There's an element of agency and motivation when students feel that their ideas are valued, regardless of what language level they are sharing them. We can share ideas in single words and phrases that can be very powerful. So allowing and empowering students to do that within our lessons is very important for their growth. Just a couple more ideas I will let you read over. Both of these ideas are included within a new resource document that has been posted online. You have the link. Once you have these materials, the hyperlink is there. But really thinking about, as we are focusing on literacy, instruction, and development, the critical role that oral language development plays. If we think about how we learned our first language, we do that first by speaking to make connections. We have language models that we start repeating what we hear, and then we start being more independent in how we use language and practicing new forms that we've heard, but it's starting with the oral language development. Now, students who already have some oral language development in their first language, we are building on that by adding to, well, we're adding to that with the English. We also want to think about the ideas, the way students, if they are exposed to a student who has a higher language proficiency, they become a language model, and that will continue to support the growth, the complexity of the language the students are using. This is not to say that reading would not happen at the same time as students are developing those skills simultaneously once they are at school age. So we're using the oral language skills that the students have to extend into the reading and the writing. But we want to make sure that part of any literacy program for English learners, they have to have that speaking practice related to the content or what they're reading. Here are just some specific examples of cooperative structures. In other words, kind of interactive activities, ways to have students engage with each other. These are only examples, and the variety, there are many cooperative structures out there that are really great strategies to use in any or every classroom. Doesn't really matter the age or the ability of the students. Cooperative learning and these structures can be used. They give students a way to learn new communication skills, practice the skills that they have. It gets more students talking and engaged rather than a traditional method of a teacher posing a question to one student and having that one student respond. Also thinking about how you group students in these activities. Sometimes it might be a good time to have students speak in their primary language to make sense of the learning, or for a specific pair share before they then move into English and share their ideas in English. It might be that you are grouping students at different proficiency levels together intentionally so that they have the language model, maybe a level 1 with a level 2 or 3, so that they are hearing higher level language and they are exposed to that and then have an opportunity to practice that if they're comfortable. Here are a couple of other screenshots. Again, I know this is small text. It's not meant for you to read necessarily right now, but to reference later. One of the other supports is using teacher think alouds and models. There has been a lot of research recently on making learning visible, and in this case, making literacy visible. And one way we do that is by setting specific objectives for student learning. We know from Marzano's research that once students can identify what they're supposed to learn, or in this case, the language they're supposed to use, they're more likely to be successful having those clear expectations. On the right-hand side, there are just some ideas for how we are building in those think alouds and models into literacy instruction. It's important to note that when we are using think alouds and models, that we are using grade level texts. This becomes an issue of equity if students are not exposed and have practice and support with navigating grade level texts, because we know their assessments inevitably will be grade level text. So we have to prepare students with instruction and modeling with that rigor. And then moving forward, tailoring those texts as they read independently, which another way to refer to that is engineering texts. So this is also part of that same infographic I shared on the last slide. Ways that we make texts more accessible for students when they are independently reading. We can chunk them into smaller or more manageable passages. There are some free resources depending on the topic that you are reading about that already level certain texts based on Lexile level or readability. When texts are very complex, if it's possible to make those sentences into more simple sentences, there are different ways, as listed here, to adapt and tailor text to student reading level. We need to make sure that students have opportunities to read every day, that they are practicing the skills that have been modeled, and so that students can achieve success to be given a text that is close to their independent reading level with additional supports, and that's how we will continue to develop their skills in reading. Another support is readings that are relevant to the students. Some of you might have heard of the concept of windows and mirrors or sliding glass doors. And what that really means is making sure that there are opportunities within the literature students have access to for them to see themselves. That they see characters that look like them, or they see characters who are from an area where they are from. That the experiences of the characters are familiar to the students so that they can make that text to self-connection, so that they can relate, that it's relevant to their lives, that is motivating, but also helps to bridge some of the background knowledge that's really key to comprehension. It's also an opportunity to really support students in their identity. And there is a theory called the affective filter theory of how students, when they feel more comfortable, when they feel included, they are more likely to engage in the learning. So when our texts, our topics are inclusive of student identities, they are more likely to be successful. This is also an opportunity to teach students how to really think about others' ideas and respond in respectful ways, or to find connections with those that are different. So those differences are not seen as deficits, but really as assets, as we can all grow together and learn more. Along those lines, a student use of primary language. And I know not all teachers will speak all of the languages of the students when they teach, and that's okay. There are resources online, if it's even as simple as providing a couple of the words in the student's primary language. There are some bilingual glossaries are available, a link. The resource is actually out of New York, but for use in instruction, teachers can use that bilingual dictionary. As I mentioned, the link is on the Virginia Instruction Education for English Learners website. But finding a couple words that are within your lesson in the student's home language, maybe trying to say it, asking the student to say it if they are comfortable with that, maybe teaching the whole class that new word, but just a student knowing that their language is welcome, invited, and encouraged goes back to that affective filter theory, that it's part of students feeling welcome. We talk a lot about the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where students need to feel safe and included. And when we bring their primary language in, that is part of that work. Oftentimes we may think that by saying something like English only, we are supporting their English development, which we know is very important. Of course, they have to practice the language that they are developing and trying to grow. But when we tell an English learner that their English is not welcome, to say, for example, no Spanish, English only, that is sending an implicit message to the student that they are not welcome. They cannot separate who they are from the language that they've been taught to speak, the language that they use potentially to communicate with their families. So keeping that in the back of our minds, with the best of intentions, we want students to develop the English. And research shows when they have connections to their primary language, they actually will develop English faster. Virginia is actually proud to promote, as one of the 5 possible programs for English language development, dual language programs. So the use of primary language can be used and should be used to the extent possible to help students develop their English. This might be finding a text or a story that's in the student's primary language, and then the accountability for coming back and talking about it in English, but that it's there sends a message to the students that they are included, that they are valued, which is critical for their participation and motivation. Moving on to another support, how we use visuals for our instruction to support more complex tasks. So it might be a video, something the students can see. It could be just a picture. Something that is popular in language acquisition is TPR, or total physical response. We have lots of opportunities within language arts. We can act out characters, what they're doing to make sense of the text. We can show specific emotions on our faces and discuss that. There are lots of ways to make language arts instruction visible to students. I like to use an example. Again, as a proficient and literate English speaker, writer, reader, when I'm trying to put something together, I still like to have visuals there for me. I like to, when I'm reading a news article, see a picture that then might have a caption that helps to really contextualize what I'm reading. So it's not that we're taking supports away from students as they get to a specific level, but thinking about how we use support strategically to provide access for all of the students at all of the levels. Just another idea, extending the visuals in terms of anchor charts where we're adding more language in with that visual. You may also want to get your students involved in creating their own culturally relevant analogies or visuals. I know it's probably obsolete at this point, but when I was teaching a while back, there was the analogy or metaphor of the hamburger to write a paragraph, but that might not be culturally relevant for the students. Some of our students might not eat burgers. They might, it might be more soup or noodles or rice, where a burger just isn't part of their typical cuisine. So having them make connections to what makes sense to them, what's relevant for them, will engage them on a deeper level. Graphic organizers are nothing new to us, but just to reiterate the importance that it helps the students to visually organize the information. It can help with chunking. We talked about engineering texts earlier. If the point is to practice a specific skill in reading, like determining main idea, would it be helpful to have students work through a graphic organizer for that task? It makes the thinking and learning visible as well, which we saw earlier is important. Another support, we're moving into language development as students are practicing language. Sentence frames or language frames. Could be sentence starters. There are some examples within what I call the scholar sheet. This is part of the English Learner Teacher Toolkit that is new online. We want to get students talking about the content and providing them some specific ways to do that helps to enter into those conversations, to feel supported, to be able to share their ideas. Now, just to be clear, sentence frames or starters are only an entry point. Students can use language in very authentic, meaningful ways without the use of frames. So it's just a matter of providing students who need support to enter into conversations, but also providing some explicit attention to the language of the contents in a variety of levels. So even students who are monolingual English speakers and not using another language, going back to the fact that all of the students are academic language learners, if the lesson is compare and contrast, then how does that sound? We're making that explicit to students. If we think about our SOLs, compare and contrast is not always going to be same and different. When students are reading and they see the word conversely, do they know that that has really changed the tone of the passage or the information? Just one word can really shift comprehension, and making that language clear to students and the purpose of that language helps them to be successful when they are reading independently and writing with variety. Just another idea related to sentence frames or anchor charts, co-creating them with the students, maybe starting a unit or lesson where you know compare and contrast is going to be important, and say, how do you describe when things are different? Or how do you describe when something is the same? And creating that chart together. You can look at your text and passage and materials and think about what language will they need to understand within that lesson, and create your anchor chart or frames from that. You can collaborate with your grade level or content specific peers on compare and contrast, where somebody takes one text, somebody else takes another text, and then you are bringing those together. So an opportunity for collaboration. And we've gone over a number of supports, so I think it's important to talk about how you support supports. For example, here, this conversation poster came out of a professional development that was offered in a couple of places across the Commonwealth this year, related to construction conversation. So here we can see a couple of graphics that are there. We also see some sentence frames that the poster itself can act as an anchor chart. It's organized graphically based on the purpose of communication or how students would build up an idea. And then getting students actually engaged in that conversation as part of peer interaction. So again, we want to be strategic in thinking, what is everything my student would need to be fully successful in this lesson, and providing that for all students, again, as they are all academic language learners and need to be apprenticed into speaking like an expert, or in this case, academic discourse. What does academic discourse sound like at a specific grade level? And teaching students that, modeling that, having them practice that. Because if we aren't apprenticing them or training them in that, then we're missing opportunities to advance the rigor and the deeper learning. So we've gone over a number of these. This chart just really organizes some example supports in multiple ways. So there are sensory, graphic, interactive, linguistic, and one specific here for well-being. Again, this is small text, but you can find this larger handout within the EL Teacher Toolkit, which is linked within the PowerPoint. So with that, I'm going to move us into our second objective, to really identify the language, specifically language functions and frames connected to grade level SOL. So we're digging deeper into that discussion when we saw the scholar sheets of what is the language connected to what we're asking students to do. So this list is obviously not exhaustive. We know that we ask students to use language for a variety of ways throughout our grade levels. and SOL skills. As we're thinking about being explicit, what is academic language instruction that is explicit? That means that we are setting language objectives, that we think about the SOL, we unpack that, we deconstruct it, we think about what would an acceptable answer sound like or look like, and then creating that as part of the objective and frame. I wanted to just provide a couple of examples. Here, even starting in first grade, making and confirming predictions. So if I see something like predictions, as a linguist, I'm automatically thinking there are very specific ways we say predictions. And so as a first grade teacher, I'm thinking about what does that sound like? How do my students make and confirm predictions? What is acceptable at first grade? And then I'm creating the frames from that. So it might be, I think blank will happen, or blank might happen, or if then. So really thinking about what is that language of prediction. And then how are we supporting the text from which they are making and confirming predictions? Again, we can support it with visuals. We can have texts that are in the student's primary language if they know how to read in that language. It might be a flowchart where we've chunked and engineered the text where they're just reading manageable parts within a flowchart. They could make their predictions with a partner in their primary language and then repeat that later in English given a language frame. Here's an example for fourth grade. We know from the new 2017 English Standards that students will be working with paired texts in fourth grade starting then. So thinking about what is the language of paired texts. If we are comparing and contrasting, that's a very specific language. So thinking about what's appropriate for fourth grade. It could be blank differs from blank, or however, or using while to start the sentence. This also helps to support language variety, which we know is important when students are building their writing skills and later assess that sentence variety is really critical for the quality of writing. This is also an opportunity to reinforce skills like punctuation in terms of, we use a comma in this way. And when we create these language frames, we're explicit to students to say, when I use while, I have to have the period after, or the, comma after my first statement before beginning the next one. So it's grammar for a purpose or mechanics for a purpose. And then again, the same kind of supports to get students to access the grade level texts. I might just switch the graphic organizer here to a Venn diagram because it was specific to the task I'm asking students to complete. Moving into middle school for 7th grade, identifying cause and effect relationships and their impact on plot. So here, words like cause, effect, impact are all indicative of a specific kind of language because it is very popular, common for students, so easy to access for even the beginning students when we are providing that as a frame. But as we're thinking about building the complexity of language, that even my students who are monolingual English speakers still need practice, maybe using a sentence like the impact of blank was blank. Also that they can bring that into their writing or they understand this new structure when they're reading. So I'm using these sentence frames and getting students to practice them together as a way to be explicit about the language of, in this case, cause and effect that supports my SOL. So language objectives and supports are not something separate, but they are meant to support the content, learning, and instruction. And then again, you have the content, thinking about how we help students understand and access texts on the right. Moving here, we have a communication and multimodal literacies example, how we help students evaluate presentations. Here, the access support might be a specific reasons bank. What is the criteria for identifying a quality presentation? Providing those so students could then use those in their frames. So supporting, thinking about, again, what do my students need to be able to do this successfully? How do I model how that is done? How do I apprentice them into sounding like a professional evaluator of presentations? Here for 10th grade, I provided a justification example. So defending a position is something that students will need to do across the grade levels, even though this is specific to 10th grade writing. But how do students use reasoning and evidence to support their claims? We are teaching students that. We are modeling how that looks and sounds for all students, but especially for English learners. Something here to note is that a lot of students, if they have been taught to write in their first language, a lot of different cultures actually address writing in other ways. For example, some cultures may teach students, instead of making a very clear claim with reasons and support, they are talking around almost a cyclical writing style instead of a very kind of hierarchical, bulleted, outlined list of reasons. So taking that into consideration is all the more reason why students need to be explicitly taught for a specific point of writing. If we're creating an argument or defending a position for this purpose, this is how we would do it. So providing that mentor text is a way to say, we might do this for this purpose. This is how we hook our audience. That's important because we want them to read the rest of it. So being very explicit in the purpose for a style of writing and then what that looks like. So as you were reflecting on your own standards, what you're teaching, to think about what is that language function connected to the SOL? And then what does the language sound like connected to that function? So there are the scholar sheets that you would be able to use as a support, but also even going online. And I've just put into a search engine the language of compare and contrast. And there are a number of resources there that can help me think through what are the different language pieces connected, and then thinking about the lesson explicitly, which ones do I want to pull out and have students practice as part of that language objective. If you've been part of any of the English trainings, then you have seen this skill and language, or the skill progression chart. So indicating across the grade levels, the skills that the SOLs are focused on. Here, I just wanted to make just the next connection to how some of these cross the grade levels. So we talked about making confirmed predictions earlier, where we see that across most of the grade levels, and knowing that there's that specific language. So starting from even the first time that the student is exposed to that skill, if we're focusing on language, we continue to build their competence and proficiency so that they are even more successful as they go throughout their academic career. Another example, differentiate between fiction and nonfiction. That goes back to compare and contrast. So we are supporting student success by being explicit about that language, because we know that that's something that they're going to have to engage in across the grade levels. These are also, again, opportunities for teachers to collaborate within content or grade level teams to create the language objectives and frames. You may have also seen this example, the vertical articulation of the standards for English featured, well, the text features here is featured in the example. And I just wanted to demonstrate, in addition to how this one content concept spans grade levels, how the way we support does as well. So if we're thinking about these sentence frames, I'm looking at the specific SOL and unpacking it. So identify text features, such as pictures, headings, charts, and captions. What does that sound like for a first grader? It might be, this is a caption where I'm pointing to a caption, or I'm circling a caption and then vocalizing, this is a caption, this is a picture. I might even add to that, this is a caption, it says this, or this is a caption, it tells me this, or a caption goes with pictures. So I can continue to extend the complexity of what that sentence is. But even students from the beginning level can be given a frame to say this is a blank. Moving into the next one, third grade, we're using text features now. So my response, my frame for them would have to tell how it was used. So for example, I used the text feature and then identifying which one, in this case headings, in order to or to, and then how they used it. So I might give them this example and then allow them to fill in with their own information and ideas, or providing the opportunity so they can do that. This is also an opportunity for students to hear other strategies. The more opportunities students have to practice this language and hear it from their peers, the more likely it is for them to retain the information and use the language, understand it as well independently. Moving on to the next one. Again, I'm using text features, but now it's in order to predict and categorize information. So as I'm thinking about my language objective, I know that text features are a part of that, but also predict or categorize, whichever one I'm going to focus on in the lesson, is also something that needs to be made explicit. So my frame has to include both of those pieces. For example, based on the graphics, so that text feature reference, I predict. And in this case, I'll learn about geographic features. So bringing in other content areas into what the students are reading is important. But going back to what does the SOL say students have to be able to do, and thinking about the language that supports that. And then for the next three examples, it became a little bit more difficult without a specific text to refer to. So I just gave a simple frame for each of them. Since blank, I can infer blank. So again, it's analyzing, it's applying, it's using those text features to make more deeper analysis kinds of statements. So you could, again, tailor those sentence frames based on your specific text and content of the lesson. So just as a review, hopefully you have now some ideas for ways to make your ELA lessons more accessible and inclusive, including a variety of supports or unpacking the language needed to be able to create language objectives and support those language objectives, again, for the purpose of students to communicate, which is the English Language Development Standard. I did want to bring something else up as you're thinking about creating those supports and frames, the idea of second language continuum. Here, we know that we have students who are entering or just beginning their English language journey up until level 6, based on the rubric from WIDA, which is referenced here. But as we're thinking about differentiation of supports, we want to take student level into account. And I've mentioned this a couple of times. Students at the beginning level might need maybe more simple sentences, maybe single words and phrases to be able to describe the content. But then our models should increase in complexity to apprentice students, to model students how to create language at the more sophisticated levels. And then the end result, thinking about what is the end in mind, what is the task that all students need to complete and understand, the models would then be reflective of that. But students can use something that is at their current level while they are exposed to something at higher levels to practice to hear, to have that model. That is how we are going to develop students and continue them on that progression. Oh, one more point. In a lot of places, students who are at the levels 3 and 4 sometimes are mistaken for being proficient in academic language because they sound more like their monolingual English-speaking peers. They can speak in social settings. But when we think about, again, the need for academic language support, if our level 3 and 4 English learners are not getting that explicit academic language instruction, we become in danger of creating this phenomenon that happens in Virginia or across the country for long-term English learners. Those are English learners who have been in service, receiving EL service for 5 years or more. And what the research says is when students have made that transition to over 5 years of service, and I'm not speaking to those students who have identified special education needs. That's something separate. I'm thinking about the typical English learner with access to quality instruction. In order to help them avoid being in service over 5 years, to get them to the point of proficiency, they need supports, models, expectations at the higher levels of proficiency so that they can reach that level. We have about 13% of English learners in Virginia who have been receiving service for that long. So it's really just shifting instruction to think about the academic explicit instruction for language progression. There is a chart in that English Learner Toolkit that I mentioned earlier that really focuses on supporting language differentiation, not content differentiation. We are working from our SOL, thinking about what is it that students need to be able to do, and then modifying the language of that task, not what the students are being asked to do. If it says to evaluate, then all of my students in that room need to be able to evaluate. It might be in single words and phrases. It might be using a bank of words that are evaluative, like strong or, need support, whatever those criteria are. But I'm not changing what I'm asking students to do. So we are now at the end of the content for the webinar. Reflecting on our time together today, hopefully you are now able to list various supports for English learners connected to English language arts instruction and identify or know how you would identify language frames, supports connected to the SOL or SOLs you're teaching. Just as a quick note before we part ways for today, on the English language or English learner education website, under guidance, documents, and resources, this tab at the top, you can see a number of supports and infographics. And down here at the bottom, these two are where you can find the ones I feature specific for reading. So there's a reading instruction for ELs infographic that provides those strategies and ways to really enhance our instruction for English learners. And then there's another one that is specific to providing English learners with additional reading support. So that aspect of, even within a literacy program, it might not be scripted for students to have that peer interaction or to talk about what they're reading. But if it's for English learners, that has to be a part of their literacy instruction. And then on the next tab, just external resources. These are organized by topic and by content. So you can find a number of English language arts specific resources, links, articles, etc. there. There are different ones with access to or books in multi languages, to the resources that help to level readings or provide leveled readings. So please use that as a resource and to continue your learning. There are also modules from WIDA, which are free, available to all English or all Virginia teachers. There are ones specific to working with newcomers or recently arrived ELs. There are ones related to the writing rubric and how to develop student writing domain. So you can check those out. If you have any questions, let me know about those. There are some new WIDA materials coming out in 2020. There will be a training here for those as well. Just a screenshot of the other documents that I referenced so that when you pull them up online, you know what you are looking for. Here's a flyer that again has some links to specific instruction about English language arts. And then if you want to stay up to date with news, updates, professional development opportunities, resources and articles related to promising practices, please feel free to email me. My email is there. And again, these materials will be posted online. And then here again is my contact information and the contact information for my colleagues in the English department. I am thrilled that you took time out of your day to join me for this lesson. If you have any questions or any need for support related to English learner instruction, please do not hesitate to contact me. So thank you.
All right, thanks again everyone for joining us for our final webinar in our comprehensive webinar series. As if you've looked at the webpage recently, you've noticed that we still have a few remaining webinars to post for your consumption at any time that you would like. We're currently in the process of making sure all of those are accessible, and we'll have those posted as soon as possible. And yeah, thank you so much for accompanying us on this webinar series journey. And we appreciate you as an audience. Thanks and have a great day.